Hello. It's April 2016, April 15th exactly. And this is episode 49 of the Unseen Podcast. As you may have noticed, we didn't do one last week. We're now in a 2-week rhythm for the Unseen Podcast, and we'll stay on that for the time being. That allows the people in our panel pool more time and more, to concentrate their efforts on fewer episodes, so we can provide hopefully higher quality episodes on a 2-week rhythm than we did on a 1-week rhythm. And if you would like to join our panel pool and help us get back on a 1-week rhythm, please contact us at unseenpodcast@gmail.com. My name is Paul Carr, and with me tonight are David Grigg.
Hi.
Nick Nielsen.
Hello, Paul, and hello to the Unseen Podcast.
And Marsha Barnhart.
Hello, everybody.
Now, all these folks have been on so many times before. If you want to read their bios, go to unseenpodcast.com. That's where you get all the information about the podcast. And you can read their bios and learn more about David, Marsha, and Nick. Now, a couple of housekeeping things. Our next episode will be recorded on the 29th of April. As I mentioned, we're on a 2-week rhythm now. However, and then again, there'll be another one on the 13th of May. But then there will be a special episode on the 20th of May, just preceding Towel Day, and it will come out on Towel Day, the 25th of May, in honor of Douglas Adams. You may not want to be a regular panelist on the Unseen Podcast, but if you are a Douglas Adams fan and want to be on that panel, it will be an open panel call. So just send me an email at unseenpodcast@gmail.com, and I will invite you to be on that panel. I will accept it. Normally I want a panel of about 3 people, but I will accept a much larger panel for this one, and we'll go as long as we need to get everybody say in. So if you're well informed about Douglas Adams' work and a big fan, then by all means join us. I'm also looking for suggestions of what music to play for that one, since that will be a special episode. 2 years ago, we did it on the WoW Signal. We did an episode called "Oh No, Not Again," and it was at least a success from the point of view of the content. It hasn't been our most downloaded one, but if you want to listen to that, go to wowsignalpodcast.com and look for the episode called "Oh No, Not Again." It was recorded in May of 2014. So, and I hopefully, if everything works out and this podcast continues to flourish, then we will do that every year. Okay. Now, tonight, we're talking about something completely different, which was primarily David Grigg's idea, which was to talk about the long-term preservation of information, knowledge, culture into the indefinite future. So what I'd like to ask each panelist, we'll start with David. What would you like to preserve into the long-term future? Let's discuss 2 different time horizons, and I'll let you pick your time horizon. I suggest 1,000 years and 1 billion years. And let's assume for the 1 billion year that we found a technology that will let us preserve that information. And but if you'd rather use a different one, that's okay too. So let's start with you, David. What do you think?
So the question is, what should we preserve? What should we try to preserve? I would think as much as you possibly can. I certainly, but obviously my problem is I come to this from a Western European sort of viewpoint. So I would like to preserve the music of Bach and Beethoven and Mozart. I'd like to preserve the works of Shakespeare and Ibsen and all those great writers. I'd like to pass that on to the future, but that's very much from a Western white viewpoint. That I'm sure people from other cultures would want to preserve their culture. So, but the short answer is as much as possible.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we all have it's an all Western white panel here tonight. But so David, let's say you could only put a few things in a 1,000-year time capsule. What sort of things would you put in there?
Well, I suppose it's the question of what constitutes a few, and how we decide to store that stuff. So, which I think is an open issue. I don't think we should simply assume that we can preserve all that stuff. But if I was put on the spot and to say I just wanted to preserve a few things, I guess it would be maybe the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, which has been proposed before. I would say a history of brief history of the civilization that we have up to this point, and hopefully as covering as many bases as possible in terms of different cultures in that. That could be a single book. What else? Some great works of art, obviously. Would be nice to have a feeling that the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel could be preserved for eternity. Not sure beyond that.
Yeah, I think Bach's a very good choice because even though a lot of music has been developed since Bach, he kind of represents sort of the crossroads between the Renaissance and the modern era in a very broad way, and it's something that modern people can still access and understand, but
it's just occurred to me that the one thing I should have mentioned in terms of music was Handel's Messiah. I think Kenneth Clark once described Handel's Messiah as one of the few works of art, of high art, which was immediately accessible to a general audience without interpretation. And he also put the Sistine Chapel into that category. Yeah. So Handel's Messiah would also be a good thing to include.
Well, you mentioned how we would do it, and that is, that's a question of largely a question of engineering, right? I mean, we could try to preserve it digitally or preserve it in some kind of graphical form. But how would you go about it?
Well, there are two issues really, aren't there? It's one, how you preserve it, and there are methods for that, which I'll discuss in a second. But then there's the issue of how are we going to be certain that the people at the other end can access that and make sense of it. So there's one thing to be able to preserve something. For example, one of the books which I wanted to refer to tonight was a book called The Decipherment of Linear B, which is how the Minoan script was finally translated. But they had all these tablets which had been preserved for several thousand years, or a couple thousand years, but nobody could work out what they said. So it's all very well to preserve it, but you've also got to have the ability at the other end to read it and to make sense of it. And I think that's probably the harder part of it. In terms of the actual preservation, I think anything physical where we actually have a physical groove or a physical mark in something which is going to be preserved for a long time, which is then put into some sort of storage or placed in a position where it can be retained for a long time, is going to be it's going to last, like carvings in stone. Or if you look at again, another book I wanted to refer to tonight was the book about the Voyager interstellar record that was placed on that. And they basically encoded that information in terms of a physical groove in a physical copper material, which was placed so that the most important information was facing away from the surface of the motion of the Voyager spacecraft. And so even micrometeorites hitting it for perhaps a million years wouldn't get through to destroy that side. So that physical thing is very likely to be preserved for certainly for millions of years. So I think that's one way of preserving data. But the question then is the bandwidth, how much data you can store on that. And in fact, in the case of the Voyager record, it was very, very, very little.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily want to go for a vast volume of data because of the uncertainties about how it's going to be interpreted and understood, right? Unless you have some reason to believe that whoever uncovered is going to be very sophisticated. But,
Well, the complete works of Bach is a lot of data.
yeah,
The complete.
you could
You,
put it
you
on
could set it so as soon as you opened up the device, it would start playing, and then they could hear the complete works of Bach, whether they understood it or not.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to save the musical notation because that would probably be
No, who knows?
indecipherable.
Absolutely, it's indecipherable to me mostly already.
Yeah. When they see first time they see da capo al fine, they won't have any idea what that means, right? Because that's largely an Italian invention of like 400 years ago, and we stuck with it.
All the language of music is Italian, yes.
Yeah.
No, musical scores wouldn't be the way to go. But yeah. Okay.
But maybe you could come up with a better way of notating audio so that it would be, more or less, you could tie it in with some kind of mathematical notation. And
I think whatever we do has to be a physical mark, like an engraving. There's been a recent thing about them etching the entire Bible or whatever on a tiny piece of glass. That's the kind of thing that we have to go for. I think if we want to preserve stuff, you certainly can't store stuff in the form of a digital any kind of magnetic or electronic format.
Well, there's been work done lately. I mean, you have to remember everything we have now. There's been no motivation to build it to last for 1,000 or even 100 years.
Which is part of the problem. I mean, we talk about the digital dark ages, which you can refer to on Wikipedia. The digital dark ages is the fear that there will be a whole period of history where historians in the future won't be able to access it. And a lot of the stuff that we have preserved from our history has been in the form of carvings or paintings or written down material and books and scrolls and so on. That's the stuff that has been preserved. But we're already losing the ability to access the early magnetic tapes produced by NASA of the Mars Viking expedition, for example. It was a huge exercise.
The investigation of Pioneer anomaly took an enormous effort to get the old data tapes played back onto a modern digital system.
And that's in a matter of decades. So that's a serious problem.
Yes.
Well, there's an essay that's been written about that by a fellow by the name of Alexander Still, with an E on the end of it. He wrote a collection of essays called The Future of the Past, and the last essay in that collection called Are We Losing Our Memories, or the Museum of Obsolete Technologies. It takes up exactly that issue.
Right. Now, but there has been progress lately on sort of storing information in solid state devices that would essentially be self error correcting and could last for a very long time. It's just that somebody's got to have the incentive to do that, right?
And the money to do it.
Well, right.
The Corbis Photo Vault, which is being kept in Iron Mountain, and which I think was bought by Bill Gates or one of the foundations he owns, they expend an enormous amount of time, effort, and money in preserving this enormous analog photo collection. Of course, people will come along and digitize it in various formats as those digital formats change, but there also is an intense interest in preserving the actual analog original, from which the digital format versions are taken, as it were. And fortunately, there's a few people who are interested in paying for that to happen, but it's not happening across all forms of media.
Yeah, well, I came up against that recently with my wife's late mother's photographs and also my late father's slides that he took hundreds of slides when he was a soldier in Germany in the 1950s. These slides are in very good condition right now. They are scannable for sure. But then I can ask myself, okay, if I'm going to scan them, how do I, I've got something here that's 60 years old. How do I get it to where it's going to last at least another 60 years? Because
Exactly.
I don't know that my children will do anything with it. Perhaps their children will. But that's something that I like to get at least 2 generations of life out of the system so that we can have time to figure out how to transfer it. I could scan my father's slides now using a slide scanner, and I could put it onto a DVD or some other format, but I have great reservations about how long that's going to be readable by
Yeah, exactly.
the next generation.
Well, you could try to find some historical preservation project that has a vault where they try to keep things cool and dry,
Yeah.
and save them for long periods of time. In other words, will them to somebody who has the resources to preserve them. Because
my wife found some plates from her great-grandfather that were taken in Grand Rapids, Michigan around the turn of the 20th century. And they are in extremely good condition. These were very heavy photographic plates that each one weighs about a pound. But there's no device that's designed to scan them now. There's no device that can read them. So to get them scanned, you'd have to probably take them to a specialist. We've been thinking of donating them to the library in that town and just letting them figure it out. But they are.
You can make contact prints, surely.
You could, yeah, you could make prints. The quality might not. I mean, people don't even have darkrooms anymore, right? I mean,
well, I guess that's right. I guess I'm still thinking film, and photographic paper, which is barely exists anymore. Which is part of the problem.
I think there
really is.
I think Ilford still makes paper, don't they? But I'm not sure about
it's
it.
becoming a very special thing.
Yeah, you have to get it from a specialty store. Basically, it's become a hobbyist thing.
Yeah, well,
yes.
I used to have all that stuff.
Except for the historical preservationists who deal with it on a professional basis in the preservation of film and photograph.
Well, I mean, I would think that photographs from around the time of 1910s in Grand Rapids, Michigan would be of great interest to people who are interested in Grand Rapids history. But there's not going to be a lot of money to do that. And nobody's going to step forward and say, I'm going to devote my life to preserving this information. So,
well, one of the weird things about history is some of the things that survive are completely unexpected. So imagine some future time, 5,000 years from now, after we pass through 1,000-year dark age, and the only thing that remains of 20th century civilization are photographic plates of Grand Rapids from 1910. They would suddenly become enormously valuable because that would be a record of ordinary life during the early 20th century.
Well, they'll probably still be in my basement, actually.
If an archaeologist finds them there.
Yeah.
and they're not broken. So.
But these things are built really. But the thing is that I don't think we very often think beyond keeping our data for more than 15 years or so, 20 years maybe.
We don't.
My kids are not even out of their teens, and I still wonder how I'm going to preserve their photographs when they were babies. So
just think of all the emails that people send, and most emails, of course, are trivial, but some people write very long and detailed emails, and some of my earliest emails are already, they're locked in formats I can no longer access.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could probably extract the text from them, but now
I have an entire novel which was written on a Tandy Model 1 computer and stored on audio cassette tape. Now, I do have a printed copy of the manuscript still. It's a pretty bad novel, I have to admit. But nevertheless, the printed copy is far more likely to be accessible in 100 years' time than the audio cassette tape, which is probably already impossible to access anyway.
Right. I don't even have a good cassette player anymore. I threw the last one out about a year ago.
Right.
One could almost formulate a rule that the earliest technologies are the most robust technologies because we possessed megalithic monuments that are thousands of years old, and then we have written texts that are carved in stone that are thousands of years old. And as you go forward in time, we know books can last 1,000 or 2,000 years, and if they're printed on vellum or a really good cotton paper, they can last a long time. And the most recent technologies are the most ephemeral. But yeah, books have proven themselves robust, and carving in stone proves itself robust.
Yeah, but of course, today we have orders of magnitude more data to preserve. So,
yes, it would be a fun calculation to find out how long it would take or how much space it would take to carve the world's information today in stone and put it on a big wall.
Right. Well,
we have a very big wall.
we lost. There was one fire at the Library of Alexandria that deprived us of probably a huge amount of information about ancient knowledge that we will never get back.
And culture. I mean, if you look at Sophocles, for example, we have 7 plays by this Greek playwright Sophocles, each of which is a masterpiece. He wrote something like 120 plays, and we've been able to recover 7, and so that's a great loss to culture. Excuse me, that's a loss to culture.
Yeah.
In some cases, however, our high technology, which is an ephemeral storage mechanism, turns out to be able to recover past cultural records. There was a library at Herculaneum, which was buried at the same time Pompeii was buried by the pyroclastic flow of the mountain there, Vesuvius. And scholars since the 18th century, when this library was found, I think maybe later than that, scholars have been trying to figure out what to do, and now they've been able to scan with a 3-dimensional scanner these rolled up sintered scrolls and extract a very small amount of information from them. And as computer technology develops, it might be possible to virtually scan them and unroll them and read the whole thing.
Okay, I want to get Marsha in on this. Marsha.
Yes, I've been sitting here thinking, and I, having heard your original thing that you said, this be kind of a time capsule thing. Time capsules are those physical things that are put away. They aren't rummaged through until a particular appointed time, right? So you pack this time capsule full of whatever it is you want, and you bury it, or you somehow secret it away, or you protect it for a long period of time. Now, in that case, what I would think to do is, you're talking about like 1,000-year time period out, and then a timeline. And what else?
You pick a horizon, but I'll say 1,000 if you don't want to pick one.
Yeah, and also I was wondering if this might be something that the people of Earth would be rummaging through in 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, or if other beings might come to this planet and find. Those are 2 different kind of audiences.
Well, that's why I said a 1 billion-year horizon as well, because whatever they are, they may be our descendants, but they won't be like us very much.
Yeah. They won't be from Kansas. Well,
that may be the only places left.
What I was thinking is I had kind of a fantasy that if you're talking like, 500 years out, it would be neat to have cryogenically preserved brainiacs from different disciplines that when they lived the end of their life, they would go into this preservation state, and they would be subject matter experts of some type that could be resuscitated and then used as a living source of information from this time that they were terminated, so to speak, all the way to the knowledge they had from at the very beginnings of knowledge in our earthly existence. So that would be kind of neat. And it is something that might be soon capable. Now, my long-term thing would be that if you had a very simple playback device and you had stored on either hard DVDs or little small these little drives, USB drives. You had a big stack of these that were preserved inside a container, that when the container was opened, it would launch the playback of this thing. It would be animated and it would launch the playback of whatever it is you needed. And the first thing that would play is how to operate and pull out these little things and shove in all these others. And you would have access to all the information that was on, for example, the Encyclopedia Britannica, up to the point that this thing was buried. And my third thing, and this is the last one, it would be neat to be able to preserve in a time capsule DNA of a cornucopia of living species on this earth. And anybody who would find that in like a billion years would probably know what to do with that and bring things back that had gone extinct hundreds of thousands of years before. That's how I would want to do a time capsule.
Well, that the DNA idea is a pretty good one, and one I hadn't thought of. If you can figure out a way to preserve that much data for a really long time, which I think is certainly possible.
Yeah. The receptacle would be everything. The receptacle would be something that would not have to be empowered through the entire period. So, there's nothing probably that is going to keep power to play something or keep something cool unless you put this down in. That's what you do with the human DNA or the DNA of living things. You would put it down in an area that would stay a homeostatic temperature that was acceptable, and that's how that stuff would be preserved, possibly.
No, I don't think you need to do that. I think because DNA, when it comes down to it, is just information. All you need to do is write down the sequence of the base pairs and store it the same way you would
In
store
stone,
it
of course.
any
As long as it wasn't damaged, if it
Yeah.
wasn't damaged. Now, I don't know how. Obviously, I mean, we can get DNA out of creatures that lumbered around the earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, and they've just been moldering in some, I don't know, tar heap somewhere. So yeah, you can get a lot of information from a very, very, very old creature.
Yeah, I was actually just at the La Brea tar pits for the first time in many years, and it does preserves bones extremely well over hundreds of thousands of years. I don't know if it preserves DNA. Well, they did get some DNA out of it.
Yeah, some places really preserve tissue too. Under certain conditions, viable tissue is preserved. In the cold tundras in Russia, they're
Right.
finding viable tissue.
If
I
it's
think
in a
of
permanently
some,
frozen place, which is
yeah,
probably
yeah,
over a very long time, the tissues they found are tens of thousands of years old.
yeah.
But over much longer than that, you're probably going to have a problem finding a place that's been permanently frozen.
Well,
It's very unusual, but there are some soft tissue fossils well, these are fossils, of course. They're not actually the tissue themselves, but the soft tissues are sometimes preserved, but it's very rare.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Does anyone recall the? I'm pretty sure it was a John W. Campbell editorial. I couldn't find it. I looked for it before this podcast, but I'm pretty sure there's a John W. Campbell editorial which suggested that the best way to preserve data over billions of years was actually to encode it in DNA and then spread it as a virus or some very rapidly multiplying creature that spreads across the earth and preserves in its what we would call junk DNA the information in that way because it's passed
You mean
on
a
to
host
its
creature?
descendants.
A host
Yeah,
creature?
well, let's say
A
a
microbe.
fly, a mosquito, a microbe, much better, a bacteria. So you somehow encode this information into DNA, which I've seen done very recently, actually, encoding information into DNA. and then it's carried by a host creature which goes forth and multiplies and hopefully survives for many millions of years as a
Well,
species.
actually, when you think about it, we are a host creature for the continuous supply of DNA.
Sure.
And
Indeed, and we carry our history around with us.
yeah, and we are encoded as time capsules. But the thing is, of course, now there's breakdowns and there's errors and then there's mutations. And so it could be 1 billion years ago, somebody might have thought that was a great way to carry information forward. But along the line, we had mutations and breakdowns, and you got us. Sorry.
Well, there are, yeah, but I mean, we do know, at least for millions of years, that things like endogenous retroviruses are preserved.
But what do they tell us? What do they tell
Well, they
us
tell us,
about the past?
well, we know that chimpanzees have the same ones, so that we know that we're related to them. Uh, the those retroviruses were viruses that somehow got into germline cells, and so were passed on, and they are basically chunks of inactive DNA sitting in our genome and sitting in the other primate genomes that tells us that we're related. That
The only thing about that is, though, it is not a vast array of all the knowledge that was known. It's just bits and pieces of us that were carried from the past, but
right.
it's not like a record or something that you can plug in and say, oh, this is how they spoke.
Oh yeah, it's completely
this is how
random.
populations were. Yeah, it's very little information.
Well, you know,
it is existing information, but very little does it tell you.
Carl Sagan actually was one of the people that was interested in looking for messages in the human genome that were left there by who knows who, maybe hundreds of millions of years ago. No such messages have been definitively found, although some people think they're there.
Well, some people say our junk DNA, which isn't junk, is just waiting for us to understand
most of it is inactive. It doesn't have any biological effect.
But that's because we don't know anything about it yet.
I wouldn't say we don't know anything about it. That wouldn't be accurate. We know quite a bit about it, and it's been sequenced, and we know that it doesn't produce proteins, so it may have some control. Some of them have control over other genes, and this is a very complex situation. But we do know the vast majority of the DNA that humans carry is not genes. It's just sequences, and we have in common with microbes roughly 60-70% of our genome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
well, it just doesn't make sense to me. It just does not make sense to me that there's all this material in our DNA that is throwaway. I mean,
well,
maybe
it wasn't. It was useful at one point, but it got turned off by other genes because it was no longer useful or even harmful.
It makes perfect sense to me because this is the analogy with a computer hard disk drive. You imagine on a computer you're putting in documents and images and so on, and then you delete things and you write new documents, you put new images down, you delete those. What you end up with is if you actually look at the structure of the data, and this is what people like the FBI can do, is you look at the actual data laid down on that hard disk, and it's a complete mess of little bits of all these previous documents, or little bits of these previous images, all there, some which have been partially overwritten, some which haven't. And it's just that the indexes to the starts of those files have been lost. But using forensic techniques, you can recover that stuff. It seems to me that junk DNA is just like that. It's the fragments of things which have been overwritten over the centuries, of the millennia, I should say.
So the human just didn't have a defrag device.
That's exactly right. It didn't have a clean slate to begin with. It's like a palimpsest where it's a document where things are written on top and scrubbed off, and then something's written on top of that and scrubbed off. But you can see little tiny bits of the previous messages there, and that to me is what junk DNA sounds like.
Yeah.
Although my understanding is that the latest biological research is casting doubt on the idea that it is junk. So I'm kind of with Marsha along those lines.
Well,
is that we may not understand its importance to the development of a creature,
Now, when you take a look at how the brain got built, for example, and it started out a very, very reptilian, nothing little stuff that's going to run a few autonomous systems, that's your first layer, right? So maybe some of the junk DNA, and I hate that term, might have had to do with the operation of that has kind of been given a secondary and tertiary importance now in the human. So maybe the junk DNA is from that, like you were talking about.
If it doesn't encode for a protein, or it doesn't control another gene that controls for a protein, then it doesn't have a biological effect.
I don't know. That sounds like scientific hubris to me.
Well, I think
that's
very well. It's very well researched. We don't know everything about it, but
we don't know. We know nothing.
I wouldn't say nothing. No, I can't think.
Pretty close to nothing.
No.
Of all there is to know, we're still finding out so much.
Well, there's a lot more to know, but to say nothing, we know nothing about the genome, that would be inaccurate.
When there's all that to know, I don't know that we know all that much, especially when calling residue that is in the very fiber of who we are.
But I mean, it is exactly what we expect from evolutionary theory, that there would be lots of DNA that just goes along for the ride that is no longer biologically active. Because we used to be fish. When we were fish, we had different DNA that did different things that we don't need anymore.
Isn't it interesting that the biology did not have a way to scrub that out of a system? That it just piles up and like becomes.
There's no evolutionary incentive to get rid of it.
Unless it's maladaptive. If it's maladaptive, it'll be purged very quickly.
Well, if it's maladaptive, it just gets turned off, basically, by other genes that just simply say, no, you can't make a protein here, and you're done.
Anyway,
well, I don't know what to think of it.
I think we're getting off the track of the theme of the topic of the discussion, however, but it's been interesting.
True. Well, I still haven't heard Nick say what he would put in a time capsule.
Okay. You had explicitly mentioned the two time frameworks, 1,000 years and 1,000,000 years. And I think if we talk about a time capsule for 1,000 years, we would assume that a civilization would open it at the other end. Human civilization is already several thousand years old. There's no reason to think that there wouldn't be somebody around. Well, there might be, a nuclear war or something, but largely we assume there'd be some kind of civilization at the other end. So I would want to preserve significant relics of civilization, but I don't think the people who own Rembrandt's The Night Watch or the Mona Lisa would want to put it in a vault somewhere. So the best I think that could be done would be a snapshot of the internet that it could be, you assuming a civilization is going to open it at the other end, some kind of coded information that gives a snapshot of the world as it is today, stored in some kind of mechanism that you figure can last 1,000 years, which is something that human beings have a good familiarity with 1,000 years. As I said, we know that books can last 1,000 years. If you're to fill a storage container with thousands and thousands of really well-produced acid-free books with a lot of information about the current world, that would be pretty significant 1,000 years from now. But when we start thinking about a much longer term horizon, 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years, we can no longer assume that there's going to be a civilization opening it at the other end, or as I think Paul implied earlier, whatever opens it at the other end might be our successors, and we might be their ancestors, but they're not going to be very much like us. And if they have a social institution, it would be what I call a post-civilization successor institution. And we don't know what that's going to be like. But one thing we do know is that the Earth is geologically active. And one of the most significant things that human beings have done in our little brief window of civilization has been to build cities. And some of the most beautiful cities in the world, say like Venice and Rio de Janeiro, are waterfront cities that are going to disappear if not in the short term, with over short geological time, sea level rises can go up and down 100 or 200 feet. So you could easily drown something like Venice. Over the longer term, when you start talking about 1 billion years, you start talking about plate tectonics that is going to destroy most of the oceanfront cities in the world. So the question that I've thought about many times is, how could we preserve Earth's great cities, or some memory of Earth's great cities? Well, one way to do that would be virtually. But then if you're talking about 1 million years or 1 billion years, a virtual record of a city would require some kind of computer storage mechanism and some way to experience it virtually. And that would be very difficult to do that. If we start thinking of extremely high technology civilization in the future and what it might do, I wonder if we might pull entire cities off of the Earth and put them in a very stable place in our solar system where they wouldn't be destroyed by plate tectonics. So I would like to see entire cities preserved if it were possible, but that would take technology that we do not have now, or the virtual technology that we have to do that. To preserve the memory of them would probably not be able to be preserved over 1 million years or 1 billion years.
Well, what sort of things? So cities. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. If you have, let's say it's a 1,000-year time capsule. What would be your favorite things to put in there?
Pretty much the same things that David Grigg talked about. I would like to, great works of civilization, with any civilization. We all know that every civilization has produced masterpieces of painting, of sculpture, of music. It becomes a little more problematic when it comes to performing arts. So I would like to see a collection of the greatest things that human beings have produced, as well as samples of what our biosphere has produced. If we're talking about a longer term phase, 1,000 years from now, if it looks like we're going through a major period of biodiversity loss, it might be very nice to have complete or nearly complete preserved set of beetles or butterflies or anything like that that's very vulnerable to environmental change and might not survive. How people put a pin through butterflies and put them in a big case so you can see them in museums. That could be a very valuable record of the biodiversity of our particular time that we are losing, unfortunately.
Right. Now, what about some of the least valuable things that our civilization produces, but which are available in enormous quantity, like all our trash? We have
archaeologists love
television shows. That's right. They learn more about us from our trash and our leavings than almost anything else. The study of the Vikings in the city of York in the north of England is fascinating, and we know most of what we know about it from digging up the latrines that they left behind, and we can determine what they ate, so yeah, the junk is good.
Yeah, and we are leaving so much of that almost certainly some of it will be available. In fact, I've often thought that if civilization collapses, the place you would go to look for materials and resources would be the old landfills. And in digging that up, you'd find all kinds of things. Is it possible that what a civilization doesn't value, what they throw away, is eliminating as what we decide is our finest achievement?
It seems to me
Absolutely.
the most basic books about how to get a civilization up and running is important too. I mean, if digging through old landfills, great, but that doesn't tell you how to
But do we know how to do that? I mean, civilizations don't come up on a master plan, right?
No, but when a civilization finds the key to another civilization's greatness, it takes a key text or something to unlock, then they can get up and running accelerated. And that would happen if you left simple little books, how-to books. I mean, I'm talking simple.
Firefox books.
Yeah.
Like Euclid's Elements, for example.
Just real simple stuff. Here's how you make tin.
Well, sometimes not so simple stuff. If we look at the obvious example of what Marsha is talking about is the recovery of books from the ancient world during the medieval period, many of which made their way into Arabic civilization and then were retransmitted to Western European civilization through Arabic translations. And some of the most, one of the books that made a very, very big difference in Western European history was the preservation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, which is the huge digest of Roman law that was compiled at the order of Justinian, who was the Eastern Roman Empire. And it's a very technical work. And when you see a medieval manuscript today and you see the gloss, that is to say, the marginal commentary on the work, a lot of the times these glosses were necessary for the medieval readers who didn't come from this civilization to understand what they were reading. So you can see these medieval texts where there's a little square of text, and then next to it there's a running commentary, and then next to the commentary there's another commentary around the edge of the page of that, in order to try to make it possible for people to understand these technical works from antiquity that they could not otherwise understand. But something as sophisticated as Roman law had a very big impact on the reemergence of Western civilization after what historians no longer like to call the Dark Ages. But yeah, they were pretty dark.
Yeah, and they had repositories of knowledge, and they had people who could interpret them. And the repositories of knowledge were often the churches, and the interpreters were the literate, priests and monks and such. So that was the time capsule that carried that information through. I mean, some people tried overtime trying to destroy that, much like they're doing right now in Syria and such, but that was their conduit of bringing knowledge through until the Dark Ages was finally illuminated again.
Well, yeah, but the early Muslims were great scholars and great architects and
Yes,
great,
and
and
astronomers.
yeah, they weren't anti-knowledge at all.
No.
I think that the other book which was relevant to recover and which had a huge influence in the Middle Ages was the book by Lucretius on the nature of things, Roman writer. And I just read a book recently by Stephen Greenblatt called The Swerve, which argues that the rediscovery and translation of that work really triggered off was fundamental in triggering off the Renaissance, because it talked about it's in that book. In fact, Lucretius talks about how everything is made of atoms, little tiny indivisible particles, and it was one of the first things which sort of said, well, faith may not be the way to explain everything, but this sort of scientific, in our terms, scientific approach to things might be a better way of approaching the world. So I think Nick's absolutely right that there were works from antiquity which lasted which were rediscovered after a couple of thousand years, which had a bigger influence.
I just heard about that book, The Swerve, when I was listening to a set of lectures by Dorsey Armstrong about turning points in medieval history. So, and she discusses that in the last of her lectures. Oh, there you've got it, The Swerve.
Okay. We'll get that in the show notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's also interesting to point out that this is exactly the model that Isaac Asimov had in mind when he was talking about the foundation that would preserve civilization through a coming dark age. And I think it points to an interesting distinction that we haven't made explicit, but is implicit in what we've been talking about, which is that between active archiving and passive archiving. If you have a monastery where people are copying manuscripts and passing them down, so they're in the next generation of monks, not their children because they didn't have children, but the next generation of monks would then copy them and pass them down. That's an active archive or a foundation or whatever you want to call it. Whereas a time capsule is a passive archive. You're putting stuff in, you're trying to preserve it, and so it hopefully can be found by somebody or something in the future.
Yes, and properly interpreted.
Yeah.
Of course,
That
even
reminds me. Sorry, that reminds me a lot of the story of the novel Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller. Yeah,
yeah,
where the
Walter Miller.
monks are preserving electrical circuit diagrams.
Yeah, that's one of the greatest science fiction novels ever written.
Yeah.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
but that sort of raises the question, right? I mean, if the language is lost, if the symbology is lost,
hmm
if you don't have a Rosetta Stone,
Yeah.
it may all be lost.
Yeah, if you don't have the key, you have gibberish.
Well,
Well, if people things can be completely lost. Like earlier, I think David Grigg was mentioning Linear B. There were no living speakers of Linear B when that was deciphered. It was deciphered by pure brain power of very clever people who wanted to figure it out. And so, yes, sometimes one very famous artifact um, is the Phaistos disc, which is a small disc which has some markings on it that some people believe to be a language, but it's not certain. So nobody's been able to figure that out, but we did have enough information to figure out Linear B. And I think if anybody had a good chunk of our civilization, they could certainly interpret our language if they had any degree of intellectual sophistication. It's when you have too small of a sample. Paul just mentioned the Rosetta Stone. That was one piece of stone with the three forms of language: Egyptian in its traditional picturesque form, its demotic form, and then in Greek. So that made it possible to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and that wasn't a whole lot of information, but it was enough.
mhm.
Yeah, it was.
What about?
I think that's,
Yeah, go ahead.
that's certainly going to be the issue with trying to preserve something over a million years. Is just how do you ensure that what you've put down is in any form understandable or readable? It's a major issue whether they're humans or aliens. If you're talking about that sort of length of time, then it becomes a real issue. So maybe you're better off trying to preserve images or audio than you are something, or certainly images.
Or
I don't know.
mathematics, right? I mean, it's easy. It's certainly possible to depict mathematics in images, uh, and even fairly sophisticated mathematics.
I mean,
And
music's mathematics, really.
well, you can put it in music and numbers, yes,
Mm.
but
I mean, this whole issue was, of course, addressed when they decided on what was going on that Voyager record, the Voyager spacecraft that was going to be one of the first things to go outside the solar system. And they had a very short period of time, a matter of a couple of months, I think, to decide what was going on that record and how were they going to ensure that at the other end, when humans eventually rediscover that spacecraft or whatever, how were they going to allow people to make sense of it? And they had to make some choices about, and they tried to build up a system of information from basics, but it was a very low bandwidth method they chose. But it's still dubious, I think, whether anyone, even an alien species much more intelligent than us, would actually be able to figure it out.
yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a guy who I've been trying to get on uh, the WoW signal for a long time. Maybe at some point we'll be able to do this, but his name is Douglas Vakoch, and he's the director of interstellar message composition at the SETI Institute. Uh, and his job is to think about the universality of messages, and it turns out to be a really difficult problem. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
This is
Yeah.
related to the problem of marking nuclear waste dumps, as people have tried to ask themselves, how are we going to mark a nuclear waste dump so 50,000 years from now, when there's another civilization, if any civilization, people are going to know this is dangerous. Is there any universal symbol that could be immediately interpreted as danger, stay away?
Yeah, and I don't know if that's a solved problem.
No, it's not a solved problem, but it is a problem that can be addressed by selection, because if people any creatures that hung around a highly radioactive site would experience disproportionate mutations, would not be beneficial. Or there might be some beneficial ones, though.
Yeah.
Well, in the case with
Too
this,
slow.
We solved that
with-
by killing them. Yeah.
in the case of the SETI guy, the difficulty is trying to determine as a human what a non-human entity would find of interest or interpretable.
Yeah. Well,
That's a tall order.
we have to assume they'd be interested in understanding us, but then we have the question of, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a fair assumption that, but not everybody agrees with this, but that anyone with an advanced civilization would have a decent understanding of mathematics, and would know something about numbers, and you can start with that.
That of course is the premise of H. Beam Piper's story Omnilingual. You familiar with that short story, science fiction short story?
No.
The human beings have gone to another planet, and they found the remains of a civilization which has long since expired, and they struggle for years trying to figure out how what all the written works mean that have been left behind. Well, perhaps not years, for months anyway. And it's only when they finally discover, they uncover the equivalent of a classroom, and they find the equivalent of the periodic table of elements, which presumably is universal. And they can figure out from the names that have been given to those elements, things like oxygen, which is an acid-forming thing, and so on. They can figure out from that clues to the meaning of words in the language, and that's the key to the eventual understanding of the language.
Oh.
So it's really through the knowledge of the periodic table and the nature of the elements that they use that to be the key.
That's a circuitous route.
Well,
But
it's
it got
actually
them there.
it's not
Good
a
story.
bad idea at all, actually.
The classic story.
Yeah, because the elements will be the elements everywhere. We're pretty sure of that. Whether any sophisticated culture will have to know that there are elements. So
Well, any technological civilization, generally speaking, will have a basic grasp of a variety of different sciences and the mathematics that underpins them and relates them together as sciences. So yeah, the periodic table, you could take that. You could take natural selection if you like. You could take mathematics pure if you like. But if somebody's developed a technological civilization, they're able to build radio telescopes and the like, they're going to have a knowledge of electronics, which implies enough science to make that happen.
yeah. Okay, let in the few minutes we have left, let's talk a little about get a little more speculative on this billion-year time frame. Where would you, assuming you had a way to preserve information for 1 billion years, where would you put it?
I would put it above the Earth. I'd put it on a stable platform that would be linked into an Earth orbit, and that's how I would do it. You leave it on the Earth, as many of you guys have been saying, the Earth is very unstable. It is so dynamic that where you put something going to, blow up in a volcanic eruption or something. So above the Earth, I would say.
Of course, anything in near the Earth is going to get hammered by collisions over a long period of time. So it'd have to be inside something pretty strong, but it's feasible.
Yeah.
I certainly think that's right, that you've got to get it off the surface of the Earth.
It's got to get off the planet.
Maybe the Voyager spacecraft is the kind of thing. Maybe we do launch it into interstellar space.
That may be the only artifact of human civilization that survives. But
everything we launch should have something like that on it. You know it? Everything that we put out there should have a little bit more of a tidbit of information about us from this point forward.
Absolutely. I actually was trying to figure out whether the New Horizons carried anything at all.
Well, it's got some signatures and things like that, but it
doesn't.
Nothing like the Voyager record.
I mean, even the Pioneer craft had a plaque on it which said something, but
yeah,
I couldn't find the equivalent for New Horizons.
Yeah, I think that part of that is that the odds of it ever being found by anybody are so low that it's more of an exercise for us humans to think about what we really value than it is for the future, right? I mean, it's not.
Well, it was a
It's
lovely, naive gesture.
Yeah.
It may bear fruit, it may not.
Well,
it's vanity publishing.
it is. It is kind of. Yeah, it is like that. Yeah.
Fantasy publishing for the human species.
Yeah. We don't think anybody's ever going to read it, but it's good for us to go through the exercise, right?
But as much stuff as we're putting out there, we ought to shove a plaque on everything.
Well,
I think one good place to put an archive of terrestrial civilization would be on Mars, because Mars is much less geologically active than Earth. And when the sun begins to expand in 5 billion years or more from now, and it goes nova, it may expand all the way to the orbit of Venus or the Earth, and it certainly will scorch those planets. But Mars might be far enough out to remain relatively cool and relatively stable. And then when the sun shrinks again, it should still be there.
yeah.
So it's something to think about.
Especially if it was underground.
Yeah. I think Mars has 1 billion years. Yeah. Now it will see impacts over that time, but
Oh yeah, impact. But I think that, like you say, if something was buried deep below the surface of Mars, it's going to be pretty geologically stable for a multi-billion year period.
yeah, I think
But then
Mars is
how
not
would
a
they
bad idea.
find it? How would they find it, Nick? It's buried down there. How do
Build
you
a pyramid. Build a face on Mars.
Well,
think
we
that's
have the little
been
problem with
done,
wind erosion there. There's millions of faces on Mars, and none of them are really faces. But
Now, wouldn't that be interesting if the geological huge formations like our pyramids and stuff were the ancients trying to say, "Hey, look here."
well, they
I
are.
thought
That's
that-
exactly what they were doing.
But we've looked there and we didn't find anything.
Well, we
Something's
found their
missing.
tombs, which is I think
Yeah,
what they
but
wanted
I
to
don't.
find.
I don't know. The jury's out on that.
Well,
I thought they were just being used to store grain.
Well, I don't know. You could. They were astronomical. You know, they had an astronomical purpose.
But here's another way to think about this, though. If another civilization or another species were to come into our solar system long after our civilization was dead,
Yeah.
and maybe even after Earth had been scorched and left, it would be pretty obvious that Earth had once been a geologically active planet with a very viable biosphere.
Yeah.
But Mars doesn't have that look unless, thousands of years pass and we build a huge civilization there and we terraform it. But if Mars remains pretty much as it is, any other species coming into the solar system that sees a large monument on Mars, they'll immediately know that's been put there by a civilization to mark something that the civilizations are not naturally going to emerge on that planet because it never had much of a biosphere.
Mm-hmm.
right.
It's easy. It's easy. It's been done. We just build a monolith.
Yeah.
Yes, we build a monolith.
But there's no doubt that Mars is going to be terraformed by humans in the very near
I
future.
think there's doubt about that. Yeah.
I think
I
there's
don't.
doubt about that.
Really?
Well,
Really? What
it
are
all
we going
depends
to do? What are we going to do? Sit here and throw
because
spears at one another?
Well, we can build much better habitats with much more comfortable conditions, much more fine-tuned to human preferences by building artificial habitats in space that aren't on planetary surfaces. But and of course they'd be vulnerable, but
you can get underground and you can have little
who wants to live underground?
There are ways. There are very simple ways that exist right now to be able to get mirrors to bring a real nice flow.
Well, I don't want to deflect this too much
in.
into terraforming, but
A future episode, yes.
my skepticism about huge top-down projects is really why I think there's a doubt about it.
Well, I don't think NASA's going to do it, but if you got a couple of coins to run together, then Bigelow or Phillips or God only knows.
I think you need a lot of coins to run together. It would be a huge effort. Of course, I think that it could happen. I'm not saying it can't happen. It's physically feasible. It's just that I have the same problem with, say, Dyson swarms. I think that that kind of top-down uh, centrally planned transformation of an entire solar system is unlikely to happen.
Yeah.
It would, you know, when Kardashev was putting together his scale, he was living in the Soviet Union, where the idea of central planning was the way they thought about things. But
And many people refer to the architecture of the period as Stalinist gigantism.
yeah, but well, we'll talk about that another time. But yeah, I think that uh, any project we're talking about preserving our culture over indefinite time periods is probably going to be the work of volunteers who are doing it because they want to, and maybe have a few coins to rub together, but they're not going to be. It's not going to be a giant. Uh, Something like the pyramids was done out of religious fervor. I think
Take
than
for example, right now the seed bank, though, Paul. That is something that, just exactly as you're saying, the seed bank is being managed by volunteers in a great big side of a mountain.
Well, it's in the Arctic, right?
Svalbard Island.
Yeah, Svalbard, which is where polar bears live, and a lot of satellites do their
But
Earth
what I'm
contacts
saying is,
from there.
it wasn't a government program. It was concerned people got together and did that. So you're saying that anything that's going to survive would be a bunch of concerned citizens who really found that imperative.
Right.
I think the Norwegian government is very involved with
Yeah,
Svalbard.
they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that in terms of grand schemes by a civilization, a civilization is really a plural thing. It's many, many different entities with their own interests, and it's entirely possible that we will, over the next few hundred years, find ways to preserve a lot of information about our civilization for a very long time. How long that is, kind of a guess right now. I would say possibly, on the order of 10 to the ninth years, a billion years. But and where we would put it, well, we'd probably want to put it in some place that's geologically inert and not, and probably want it to be redundant. We'd put it in more than one place in case of a major impact or something like that. Far from the sun, farther from the sun than we are. So putting on the moon would not be a good idea, because the moon is going to be incinerated when the sun goes to a red giant. So,
but is it really going to matter when you think about that? My God, is it?
Well, it would matter. It's only going to matter, as far as we know. It only matter to the beings that decide to do it. Just like the pyramids mattered a whole lot to the Egyptians who built them.
There's a relevant story here, which I've already linked in the chat, which is the story by Arthur C. Clarke called "The Star." Do you know that story?
I probably read it once long ago. I don't.
But basically, the humans from Earth have come across the remnants of an ancient civilization, but they've built this vault, and this planet is going around a star which has turned nova a couple of thousand years ago, and the whole planet has essentially been melted, and there's a bit of a pylon, but there's this huge underground vault which contains the entirety of the culture of the civilization which they were able to preserve. And the motive for doing this really is just, we think we've created good things and we don't want it to be lost forever. But of course, the trick of the story is the star went up in 0 BC and was the Star of Bethlehem. And the person who's talking about this is a priest, and he's suffering a crisis of conscience about the fact that the Star of Bethlehem has actually destroyed the civilization. So it's an interesting story from that point of view. But from the point of view of the civilization itself, they just, they felt they had contributed something to the universe, and they didn't want it all to be lost. And that would be our motive, I would have thought.
Yeah. Or I think the Benfords have written about this in their SETI papers about SETI beacons and why what the motivation would be. One of them might be to say we were here, we existed, and so you set up this radio beacon that goes on for as long as it can until it breaks down and it transmits in different directions for as long as it can, and then you've got it may be that millions of years later somebody in another galaxy intercepts the transmission and finds out that you were there. That's all they'll ever know because the bandwidth will be so low.
Maybe that's enough.
Yeah.
And so for some people that means something, and for some people it doesn't. If you're interested in that, then to me, that I would much rather see my tax dollars spent on that than a lot of the other stuff that goes on. But different people are going to have different motivations. But I might also add that these projects that say, "Hey, we were here, we meant something," can also have an economic effect, even if they weren't intended to have an economic effect. And Keynes famously wrote that 2 pyramids or 2 masses for the dead are twice as good as one, because if you're going to spend money for a big project, you might as well, that these activities of building pyramids or saying masses for the dead can be very valuable for a civilization in terms of driving development and construction projects. Whereas from a strictly economic standpoint, you might apply the standard of, well, do we really need to do that? But when people are doing things for an idea of a legacy or for a religious reason, they're not applying that standard. But those are the things that end up lasting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, economies of scale make sense. If you want to do it in the first place, you might as well do it efficiently, economically, but you have to want to do it in the first place, and you have to see a value in it. And I think most living things, sentient beings, really find a value in them being and letting other people know, other sentient beings know that they were there, or sentient beings know that they were there.
Okay, well, actually, let's wrap it up here. I think we have more to talk about, but perhaps in a future episode. And I'll go around the table and let everybody say one last bit. And also, if you have, I have already about a dozen recommendations from David Grigg tonight, but if you have one more, you can lay it on us. And and then we will say goodnight. So let's start with you, David. Anything more you want to add?
I think we've covered the topic pretty well. It's been very interesting, I think. I could recommend the book Murmurs of Earth, which is about the Voyager, the record that they put on the Voyager spacecraft, which is fascinating in terms of what they decided to do and how they decided to do it. So that would be my recommendation. Yeah.
Yeah, that by Carl Sagan.
Yeah.
Widely available. All right. What about you, Marsha?
Well, I could recommend a 1972 sci-fi movie, very, very poignant movie called Silent Running with Bruce Dern. And it was all about trying to preserve forests and the little creatures of the forest on an earth that was choked by pollution. And at a point in time, he was told to jettison the capsules that hold these little biosystems. And it's a very poignant movie that's right down this alley. Bruce Dern and Silent Running.
Yeah, I haven't seen that in ages, but I thought it was good when I saw it. Yeah. How about you, Nick?
I'd like to make a recommendation that has very little to do with what we've been talking about today, but I'd like to recommend the lectures of Alan D. McNeil of Cornell University, who's produced several lectures for the Modern Scholar series. He has 2 sets of lectures on the evolutionary psychology. I just got the latest one from the library, the 2nd volume of that. And he also has a set of lectures on evolutionary biology. They're really wonderful. The guy really knows how to make his point, and I've learned things from these lectures that I've listened to a lot of stuff on evolution, and this is always has new stuff for me. So I think Alan McNeil is the greatest thing since sliced bread when it comes to evolutionary biology.
Okay. I'm going to recommend something that might be a little controversial, but probably not too much. Is the History Channel series Vikings. The series actually has problems. It has a little bit of clunky dialogue, and uh, you know, a lot. It has tremendous amounts of violence if you're not into that. But the it really does try to help you understand that this 8th century AD set of characters were human, but they had a very different culture from us, and it doesn't shy away from the differences. The differences in sexual morality and the attitudes toward death, in religion, in lots of things, and so it goes into of course, it has to keep the sex and violence going to keep eyeballs on the screen, and I don't mind that one bit. But the what fascinates me is the fact that you have this Viking culture in conflict with the Saxon culture in England, the Christian Saxon culture, and the contrasting that they do, and I find it quite interesting. So I think it's in season 4 now, and on History Channel, and I recommend you check it out. Okay, well, I'd like to thank our panelists, and just a couple of quick notes. We would love to have feedback on this and every other episode from you, the listener. So please go to unseenpodcast.com. You can comment right there on the blog for this. This will be episode 49. And you have a little spreadsheet where you can see what our past episodes and future episodes will look like. There's a link to right there. We have all kinds of links on that website. We also, for this episode 49, we will have all the links to all the things that the panelists have been talking about, all the books and lecture series and movies that everyone's mentioned. And so you don't have to write any of this down. We'll have it there for you right there. And please let us know what you think. If you think you'd like to be on the panel for the Unseen Podcast, send me an email at unseenpodcast@gmail.com. I'll let you know how you can do that. There's really, the only qualification is a willingness to engage and do a little homework to make sure that you understand enough about the topic to ask reasonably thoughtful questions. You don't have to have answers. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to have good questions. So, again, this is the 15th of April. Where David is, it's the 16th, I believe. 2016. This is episode 49 of the Unseen Podcast. Again, go to unseenpodcast.com for more information. Music has been by DJ Spooky, and the Unseen Podcast is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license. We'll see you again in 2 weeks for episode 50. Goodbye.